Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. My name's Nader. In this video, we're going to go over some problem sets or exercises for functions. Functions were quite a tricky topic. There was a lot going on, so I highly encourage you to try to get through as many of these yourself as possible, just as extra practice. It really will pay off in the long run. Let's get right into it. Okay, so I have Visual Studio Code open. I have a warm-up exercise and 3 exercises ready to go here. Same deal as the previous video. I'm just going to kind of read through the comments, which are the kind of instructions for the exercise, give you a chance to try it out, and we'll go through it together. So for the warm-up, I asked to create a function called chill, and it has to have the following behavior. So at the start of the function, we want to print out doing some chilling. And then we want to print out chill 1, 2, 3, all the way to chill 10. And finally, we want to print out that was ice cold. All right, and then we want to call our function to make sure we can actually see this being printed out at the end. All right, so there's quite a lot going on here. I encourage you to give it a shot. It's just a little bit of a hint. Try to see if you can find a way to optimize this part since there's a lot of repetition going on. Use a construct that we learned recently, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. But I'll give you a few seconds to try that out and then we'll go through it together. Okay, so let's create an arrow function here. So I'm going to do const. We wanted the function to be called chill, so I'll call it chill. And again, I'll just start with the kind of general syntax for an arrow function, which is opening closing brackets, equal sign greater than, which is the arrow, and then the curly brackets to mark the start and end of the function. So the instructions for this function are to first start by printing out doing some chilling. So let's console log that out, console.log. I'll just actually copy this just so it's easy. There we go. Then we want to print out chill 1 all the way through chill 10. Now, there are many different ways to do this. If you actually printed them out manually, like chill 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, no, all the way to 10, sorry, that's fine. However, as you start to see more repetitive things like this, I'd encourage you to try to think of a more optimal way to actually do this, a more efficient way to do this to save your programming hands from too much repetition. So in this case, I noticed that it's always the same word, but just the numbers changing, right? So the best candidate, in my opinion, for this is a loop. You could have used a while loop or a for loop. However, I'll just go with a for loop here since I actually know I already need a counter right away. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll say for, I'll use I as my variable. I'll start it at 1, actually. So used to starting my loops at 0. And we'll say while I is less than or equal to 10. And we want I to go up by 1, it looks like each time, because we're going 1, 2, 3. And then I'm just going to console.log, and in here you can kind of do this a few ways. You can there's a few ways to actually use console logs. We'll kind of look at this a little bit more deeply when we start to look at different types of functions that come with JavaScript. However, I'll just go with the template string syntax, which we learned in a previous video really quick in the exercises. So if you haven't seen this before, I'm just going to put the words that I want. So in this case, chill, ... I'm going to interpolate the variable into the string dynamically using a $ and opening curly brackets. In this case, I want the variable I to be printed out every single time. So this is going to log chill ... space 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way to chill 10. And that is the part that's dynamic right here that I have highlighted, the I part. Perfect. So that will log that out. And then we finally want to print out that was ice cold. So I'm going to console.log. And I'm going to do that was ice cold right there. Perfect. All right. So I hope that's it. I'm going to pull up my terminal. I probably noticed an error as I do this, but I kind of intentionally put that in there. I'm going to run node, exercise, warm up, and nothing happened. Oh, that was totally anticlimactic. So try to think of why. All right, so you probably figured out that it was this last final step that I have here. We defined the function chill right here. This is just the function definition. We need to actually call the function to execute the code inside. So in this case, I'm just going to say chill like this, and this is going to call that function, the name of the function with brackets right after. And if I run that, you'll see that I indeed get the exact output that I was looking for, doing some chilling, chill 1 all the way through 10, and then that was ice cold. Perfect. Awesome. So let's go to the first exercise. Okay, so for this one, I would like you to write a function called noRemainder. There's a little bit more complexity to this one, so let's go through it step by step. This function is going to have two parameters, number and mod. So those are the names you can use for the parameters. So the first one being number, the second one being mod. The function is going to return true if number is evenly divisible by mod, which means that there's no remainder. And it's going to return false if it's not evenly divisible by mod, which means that it does have some kind of remainder that's not zero, right? So it's going to return a Boolean value, true or false. And to test this code, we can actually use this test functions here to make sure that we actually get the correct results. So in this case, false and true if you copy and paste that code and try it. Okay, I'll give you a second to try that out and then we'll do it together. All right, so I'm going to create an arrow function again. Hopefully you're getting used to this one. noRemainder and arrow function right there and curly brackets. Perfect. So this function, unlike the previous one that we wrote, actually has parameters, which means that we're going to need to put things inside of these brackets right here. So I said that the name for one of these is number, and the name for the second one is mod. Okay, so we're going to have to provide these as arguments when we actually call the function. And they are parameters while they are basically placeholders that we can use for now inside our function definition. Okay, so step 2. The function needs to return basically true or false depending on these conditions. So if number is evenly divisible by mod, which means that if we take number and we mod it by mod and we get 0, which means that it's exactly divisible by mod. For example, if number was 6 and mod was 3, then we would have no remainder because 3 goes into 6 exactly 2 times and there's no remainder. So in that case, we want to supposedly return true. Now, there's a few ways that we could probably achieve this because this second case is technically the opposite of this first case. Like, if you think of this question, it's basically saying, well, if it's evenly divisible, then do this one thing, otherwise do this other thing. So this condition is basically contingent on this condition being false. So you could do this. You could say else return false. You could also explicitly have checked to see if it's not equal to 0 and then return false. But to keep it really simple, I'm just going to do this to see if that works. Okay, so very explicitly, if number modulus mod is 0, return true, otherwise return false. I'm actually going to clean this up slightly just to show you an even slight bit of efficiency that we can get if we do this in a slightly different way, but I'll show this to start. So supposedly, if we use these 2 lines of code here and we call our function for result 1 being noRemainder with 10 and 7, well, 10 divided by 7 is going to have a remainder, so we should get false. However, 100 divided by 10 is exactly 10 with 0 remainder, so we should get true. So I'm going to console log these out. I'm going to say result 1, and I'm just going to do these both on one line just so we can see that we can also do it that way. So we should see false for result 1, and we should see true for result 2. So we should see false, true. Okay, so I'm going to run node, and this is exercise 1. And indeed, we see false, true. So result 1 is false and result 2 is true. Fantastic. So that worked. I want you to look at this and try to think of how you might kind of shorten this code or improve it slightly. I would say that this is actually really well done code-wise. However, there is one thing we can do to just make it a little bit easier to kind of rationale about. Okay. It turns out that this function, its only job is to check if we are we're basically returning true or false. We're not returning anything else, and we're only checking this one condition here. right? So we know, let's think about this for a second. We know that if we get past this if statement, so if we fail this if statement, we know that no matter what, it's false, right? Which means that we know that we can return false. So technically speaking, we don't need this else, right? We could shorten this code to be like this. And this is mainly a preference thing to start. However, as you get more and more experience in your code, I would encourage you to actually remove as much of your code as possible, with exceptions, of course, for readability and making it easy to understand. But in this case, I think that not only is it a bit more condensed, the code, but it is much easier to follow. We know that if we get past this, which means that if this is false, we're just immediately going to return false in every single case, no matter what. Okay, which is exactly what we had in the else case as well. It's just now we can get rid of that because it was kind of implied. And we can see that if I run this, that we'll get the exact same answer. Okay, now there are cases where you have to be careful about this. For example, maybe you have many cases you're checking, or maybe you don't always want to return in this first part of the function. You have other things you want to do in other cases. We'll see more examples of this as we get more experience with JavaScript. Let's go to exercise 2. Alright, so a bit more going on with this one. I'd like you to write a function called login. Okay, eventually once we start doing a lot of full stack development, we'll actually be writing functions like this with a lot of detail inside of them. This function is going to have 2 parameters, very similar to the function that we just wrote. Its first parameter is going to be called username. We can expect this to be a string. And similarly, its second parameter is going to be called password, and we can also expect this to be a string. Inside the function body, we want to return true in these 3 cases. If the username is admin, doesn't matter what the password is, immediately just return true. If the username is monkey and the password is 123, the best, most secure password ever, then also return true. And if the username is mumu and the password is farm, also return true. In every single other case, we want to return false. And again, just like the previous example, we have a few test cases that we can try out here to see if we get the correct answer with our function. So I'll give you a little while to try that out, and then we'll continue together. Okay, so once you've tried that out, let's go ahead and do the same thing as before. We're going to create a const login. This is going to be an arrow function. We know that we want 2 parameters, first one being username, and the second being password. Perfect. And these are going to be passed in as arguments when we call the function, like over here. Now we have a few checks to do. We want to return true in these 3 cases. So we remember, if you remember from before, we looked at conditional statements and things like if statements or if else statements or if else if statements. And there's many ways we can kind of approach this. And there's ways we could also clean this up further that don't even use if statements and use other types of statements that we haven't learned yet. But that's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're learning right now. So we can say if, username. So we want to check if the username is admin. This is our first case right here, line number 9. If the username is exactly equal, triple equal to admin, then we want to return true. Right? So we have that case done. I'll just scroll down a bit to give myself some more room. Then we want to say if username is equal to monkey and the password is 123. So it's not just sufficient to have username being monkey. The password also has to be 123, given that the username is monkey. All right. So in this case, this is where we want to double check the logical operators. In this case, we want to use the AND case, where both the left-hand side and the right-hand side both have to be true. So we want both the username to be monkey and the password to exactly equal to the string 123. All right. And if both of those are true, then we want to return true. So one thing to point out here before we look at the next one, if the username is monkey and the password is something else, then we will not enter here. We will not enter this conditional statement. And if the password is 123 and the username is something else, we also will not enter here. These both have to be true for this to enter the return true case. This is the same thing for the next one. So if we say username equals to Mumu, and the password is equal to farm, then we also want to return true. All right. Those are all the cases. It looks like in every other case we want to return false. Now, one thing that you might be tempted to do is do something like this. We'll say an else return false. All right. You want to be really careful with this. Every time you have an else statement, it is kind of conjoined to the if statement, right? They go as a pair. So this else statement will only run if this if statement fails. Okay, so we could actually do all these checks. We can come down here. Only if the username is not Mumu or the password is not farm together, then will we enter this else statement. That is not really what we want in this case, technically speaking. We just want to check every single case that is not any of these three to be false. So it technically makes more sense to have this here like this, just a blanket return false in every single case that does not match any of these. One other thing that we could have done here that is also that's totally fine actually, unlike the previous case, is we could have had these be else if statements. Okay, but since these are all already mutually exclusive and there's no kind of similarities between these, either of these will work. We can have three if statements, or we can have an if, else if statement. We just have to be careful where we put an else statement if we're using that, and make sure that the logic actually flows. Okay, so that said, I'm just going to copy all these guys here, and I'm going to paste them down here. I'm just going to get rid of all of these here, and I'm going to make sure I console log test, and I want to do test 2, 3, 4, and 5. All right, so I'll leave that code up on the screen, bring up my terminal. I'm going to run node exercise 2. Let's see if this was correct. So we want to see false, true, 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 false. And we get false, true, 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 false. Perfect. So just to kind of run through this code really quick before we go to the last exercise, hello and meow, that should return false. Because if we come in here, username is not admin, username is not monkey, username is not Mumu, so we return false, right? Admin and LOL, right? So username is admin, username admin. That's true, we immediately return true. Monkey 123, we come in here, this fails, we check username monkey, that is true. So now we check the right hand side, is the password 123, and it is. So we actually pass both of these checks, which is what the and needs, so we enter return true, so that returns true. Then Mumu and farm, exact same case, but it matches this case right here. And Mumu and moo, we enter this function, we check this, it's false, this is false. We come in and check here, username is Mumu, that's true. Now we check the right hand side, which is password equal to farm? No, in this case it's not, unlike the one above it, it's moo. So this is actually going to skip this if statement, and we end up here on line 36 in my case, where we return false. All right, definitely take some time to wrap your mind around, but play around with it and try a couple more examples for yourself to convince yourself that this makes sense. Perfect. Let's go to the final exercise for this video, exercise 3. So this one is definitely a bit more complicated. We're introducing a new concept here, so take your time for this one for sure. We want to write a function called square. Square is going to have one parameter. The parameter's name is going to be num, and we can expect this to be a number. Square is meant to return the square of num, which means basically num to the power of 2. So if we give it 2, we get 4. If we give it 3, we get 9. Right? 4, we get 16. Then I want you to write a second function, and this is going to be called sum of squares. And this sum of squares function is going to have two parameters. It's going to take a num1, which is going to be a number, and num2, which is also going to be a number. Sum of squares, though, has some interesting requirements. The first requirement is that we're supposed to use the square function inside of sum of squares, which might seem kind of strange. And we want to have this function return the square of num1 plus the square of num2. So what I'm trying to get at here is I don't want you to use the exponentiation or multiplication inside sum of squares. I want you to use the function you created here, square, to do the squaring. All you're supposed to do inside sum of square is the addition and the returning of those squares. So you should be able to just use square and the plus sign and return inside sum of squares to get this to work. Here's an example of what it'll look like once we have it working. We can call sum of squares with these two numbers, and I showed you a bit of the math over here. So this one's definitely quite tricky, as I mentioned. Try it out, probably fail a few times and try again. Once you've given it a few tries, join the video again and let's do it together. Okay, so let's start with step one. We'll create a function called square. So const square, arrow function, and we have this function take one parameter, and we said it's going to be called num. Okay, so we can assume that that's going to be a number. Let's put num in here. And we want this function to return the square of num, which means num exponentiated to 2 or num times num. So there's a few ways to do this. I'll just do it really quick in one line. I'm going to say return num to the power of exponent of 2. Just like that. Okay, you could have also done return num times num. Perfect. So that is our first function. Pretty simple function. Next, we want to create another function called sum of squares. So I'm going to say const sum of squares equals to an arrow function. And this function is going to have two parameters, num1 and num2. Perfect. So the goal of this function is to use this square function and return back the square of num1 plus the square of num2. So we're not allowed to use exponentiation in here, nor are we allowed to use multiplication. Okay. So how do we go about doing that? So we want to return back. So we don't want to just do num1 plus num2, because we want to make sure that we square num1 and then add that to the square of num2. So as I mentioned, you're not allowed to do this in this case, just as a restriction to see how this will work when we use functions inside of other functions. We have a function here that takes a number and squares it and then gives us back the result, right? So if we give it a number, for example 2, it will give us back 4, and we can use that for other calculations. If we give it 3, it'll give us back 9. So if I call this function here and give it num1 and num2, let's see what happens. So I'm going to say call square and give it num1 as an argument, right? And num1 is going to go here. Num is going to get basically replaced with num1, and we're going to return back num1 squared. We can do the same here. We can do square of num2. And this is pretty much it. But if you look at this, this looks kind of gnarly, right? It's like, oh my goodness, there is a lot of stuff happening here. So I'm just going to see if this even works, and then we'll come back to explain it together shortly after. So I have two examples here. Sum1 calling sum of squares with 2 and 3, sum2 calling sum of squares with 3 and 4, and I just want to console.log out. Let's just do it on one line, sum1 and sum2. Okay, so we expect to see 13 and 25. So if I run this code, exercise 3, look at that, I get 13 and 25. That's fantastic, right? So how does this work? I'd like you, before I explain this, to kind of pause the video and try to trace what's happening. Try to see where the calls are happening, what's being returned, and the values that are actually being input into these different slots. Okay. So what's happening is on line 32. Well, actually, let me start on line 24. So we're defining a function called square it takes one parameter. Here we're defining a function called sum of squares, and it takes 2 parameters. That's all, right? Definitions of these 2 functions. On line 32 is where the interesting things start to happen. We call the function sum of squares with the arguments 2 and 3. So that's this function right here, and we're going to pass it 2 for num1 and 3 for num2. So we can kind of say num1 is equal to 2 and num2 is equal to 3 for this particular call of line 33. Then what we're saying is we want to return back the square of num1 plus the square of num2. So what the computer is going to do is it's going to first look at this. It's going to say square of num1. Okay, well num1 is 2, right? We just said that. We're passing in the arguments 2 to replace the parameter of num1. So we're actually doing this. We're doing return square of 2 plus square, and then num2 is 3 of 3, right? So what is this? Square being called with the argument 2. That is going to call this function right here, and it's going to pass it 2 as an argument. And this function is set to return that number that gets passed in squared. So 2 times 2 is 4. And we're going to replace this with 4. So this is going to be return 4 is what's going to get evaluated by this function call, right? Square of 2 is going to call this function with 2, and we're going to evaluate that and return 4. So what about 3? Then we're going to look at this side here. Square of 3, same thing's going to happen. 3 is going to be the argument for num. We're going to return 3 squared, which is going to be 9, and that's going to evaluate to 9. So what's going to happen in this line here on line 30 is it's eventually going to like turn into this right here, which is 4 plus 9, which is going to turn into return return 13. Okay, so it's going to evaluate 4 plus 9, it's going to transform that into 13, and it's going to return 13, which is what we see right here. Right? Isn't that pretty amazing? There's actually quite a lot going on behind the scenes with these function calls. Okay, for a teaser for you, we're going to get much more into depth into this in future videos when we look at different things that are built into JavaScript. But just to kind of tickle your brain a little bit, I'd like you to think of this function right here, right? First of all, is this a function? Is it a function, right? Is console log a function, right? Maybe, right? I'd like you to Google it, see what you find. And if it is a function, how might it work, right? What are the parameters that it has, right? Does it have parameters that we're not using, or hidden parameters, or special parameters, right? I'd like you to Google it and see what you find. It might be a bit intimidating at start, but it's always valuable to kind of get a hand at reading kind of these documentations from resources like MDN and others that you find on Google. But we'll answer this question and many others in future videos once we learn a little bit more about JavaScript together. So that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. These exercises are always a blast to go through together. It's really important to have this extra practice as you go through these videos, just so you get a bit more hands-on and familiarity with JavaScript as a language, and start combining these different content that we go through together and these concepts, because as you repeat these together, things like loops and functions and conditionals, and the more that you repeat them, the more that you see them happen, and the more familiar you are with them, the easier it's going to get as we get to more complex topics. So if you liked this video, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. I'd love to hear any comments you have, or if you struggle with any of these questions in the comments below. In the next video, what we're going to go through is another one of my favorite topics, which is going to be arrays in JavaScript, which is a collection, a way to kind of create a list of different items or variables. It's quite a lot into that video. I'm super excited as well to share some fancy drawings with you that I came up with. But once you've had a chance to go through these exercises and review them, I'll see you in that video.